So everyone, welcome to the very first Biocentrica Presents. Today we're going to do a career spotlight for medical writing within the pharmaceutical industry specifically. So just as a manner of housekeeping and guidelines for the audience, we're going to request that your microphone is muted unless you've been invited to speak. For all Q&A, please hold your questions for the Q&A session at the very end. And at the bottom of your screen, you'll find that there is a hand-raising tool denoted by that symbol. Please use that during that segment to ask a question, or if you prefer, you can type your question into chat, and I'll address them in order during that section. So please also use the chat function respectfully, and please do note that the session will be recorded. As far as professionalism goes, Biocentrica Presents as a series is a professional environment, so we're encouraging you to maintain a respectful, courteous, and constructive tone and language at all times. Please refrain from any disruptive, offensive, or unprofessional behavior. We might remove you in the event that those guidelines are not followed. So for disclosures, I do want to point out that all the content featured within this deck is my own. I specifically created it, except where noted. So that includes images of any medical writing assets featured within the deck. Nothing within the deck itself contains any proprietary, confidential, or factual information, or anything that's owned by any company, whether it be foreign or domestic. Permissions have been sought on certain imagery within the deck. Of course, everything is cited properly as well, or in certain cases, permission has been granted by the original owners of the content. Other than that, I have no financial disclosures to report. So, because this is a career spotlight, we're going to kick off with how I got to my career in medical writing. So, for my education and background, I actually started off in railroad engineering as a railroad track inspection engineer, and that aligned with my background a little bit, preceding my professional degree. And so while simultaneously working as the track inspection engineer, I started off with a bachelor's of science in chemistry, and that ran me through 2016. However, I wasn't too interested in the outcomes of it, couldn't find a higher degree program, and so I ended up finding pharmacy by mistake. And with that, I decided, okay, this could be a pretty cool career path. So with that in mind, I applied for a technician role in a pharmacy. Specifically, it was Walgreens, and I ran that through for about 2 years until I entered an actual program for a Doctor of Pharmacy degree because I figured it was pretty fun. I enjoyed it. I wanted to pursue the degree further. After that, I entered into a pharmacy internship, again with Walgreens, and I rode that out pretty far up until the time where I entered into a medical affairs internship. Now, that was with a medical communications agency. It was pretty fun. It was a full-time role, and I did it side by side with school. I learned so much there, and so it really sort of kick-started my career inside of the pharmaceutical industry, so to speak. So after that year was done and my internship was concluded, I ended up staying on with that specific company as a medical affairs consultant for the following year and a half. And then after that, I ended up in a postdoctoral fellowship with the exact same company. So in that fellowship, I stayed there about a year and 9 to 10 months, after which I decided to open my own sort of company as a principal scientist doing some computational research and database development. And it was also during that period of time that I entered a new role as a principal medical writer with a pharmaceutical company. So as far as my medical writing and medical affairs experience goes, I've worked with quite a lot of different companies and across multitudes of different therapeutic areas. Probably about 20 different therapeutic areas, maybe more in general. But as you can see, I've worked across the board and in a variety of different capacities, and it's been quite extensive. So what is medical writing? right? So there's a lot of different definitions of what medical writing is, and that's because there's a lot of different areas of practice within medical writing. And so because there's no standard definition, I took the liberty of creating my own. So I believe medical writing to be the creation of structured and scientifically accurate medical, scientific, and health-related content. And really what medical writing is in general is it's a sub-practice of technical writing that's centered around those industries, whether they be pharmaceuticals, healthcare, medical devices, or diagnostics. It really spans everything. And so you might be wondering, what are the practice areas that have to do with medical writing in general? Well, we've got R&D and clinical development, medical affairs and HEOR, regulatory affairs, you have your commercial and market access sort of space, and then you've got the bucket medical writing, which is everything else. So within the space of R&D and clinical development, some things you might find would mostly be pertaining to the clinical and preclinical submissions. So things like protocols, which outline the objectives, the methodology, and the procedures for clinical trials. You have investigator brochures, which provide detailed summaries of the study drug devices and diagnostics. Clinical study reports, which overview the results and the analyses of the output data. Or other things, like informed consent forms, which are for the trial participants, and those outline the study details and the risks that a patient might undertake or experience during the trial. Under medical affairs and HEOR, which is my area, we're really looking at those preclinical, clinical, and post-trial assets. So that includes things like publications, medical strategy, things that improve like product uptake or formulate new directions for your products. You have medical information, which is your response documents and your repository of information for people who call and try to learn about your product, whether it be doctors or patients. You have your real-world evidence and data, which helps you analyze products outside of clinical trials, which also relate to how you may improve use of the product and improve its uptake, things of that nature. Of course, there's competitive intelligence, which feeds directly back into that medical strategy. And my favorite part of the medical writing space within medical affairs is the training. So in my personal experience, I do quite a lot of asset development for training people like our sales partners as well as our MSLs. Moving on, we have regulatory affairs, which in a writing capacity typically involves most of the regulatory submissions such as the new drug applications, investigational new drug applications, and things like compliance as they relate to the other areas within medical writing. And what I mean by that is making sure assets that are built elsewhere are compliant, follow company policy, and things like that. Commercial and market access is more of the outward-facing material, so writers are developing things like advertisements, pop-ups, commercial scripts, any sort of promotional literature, so things that would be brought to a doctor's office, like brochures and pamphlets, or even the presentations that you might find at congresses, like product theaters, which are those promotional educational slide decks and product overviews, things like that. And of course, something that's not necessarily considered writing, but involves a lot of medical writing is the website development, right? Every product needs a website. All the information needs to be present, apparent, fair, and balanced. That falls under the responsibilities of a medical writer in the pharmaceutical industry. What doesn't necessarily count, in my opinion, would be things like articles for WebMD, health blogs, things like GoodRx articles, essentially stuff that would not lead to a career for medical writing in this specific industry. So how does medical writing function within medical affairs? There's a lot of different ways you can describe it. For me, I feel that it functions in support of medical strategy, which downstream assists in product development, its access, and its utilization. right? There's always a goal, there's always a strategy. It always needs to be put in words or in a format that's digestible for your end user, whether it be a healthcare provider or a patient, right? And so, with that in mind, medical writers in medical affairs often have to tailor their assets towards that medical planning. So, the standard method for that strategic planning involves the situational analysis, establishing the strategy, engaging in some tactical planning, and then executing upon it, right? And so that could involve assessing the disease landscape, looking at the clinical trials, any competitor products, data readouts, research, what are the stakeholders saying, things like that. And then you got to create your vision, your objectives, key drivers that promote that cross-functional collaboration within your organization, and of course working externally with your external partners as well. And then you have to, of course, build your initiatives, your execution timelines, and your criteria for success, and then implement everything on time and in budget. Medical writing as a role influences every single one of these goals in each stage in the standard method here. So let's talk about the responsibilities of the writer itself. So content creation is huge. In fact, everything that a writer does involves content creation, whether it's a revision of material you're given into a new format, or what we call de novo content generation, which is from scratch. Client engagement is a huge one as well. So depending on where you are, whether it be an agency or an industry company, clients are typically the form of actual clients where you're engaged in a sort of pay-for-service situation like with agencies, or you could have internal clients, which we also call internal stakeholders to some degree. So unlike in an agency setting where it's cash for services, internally these might be your cross-functional partners for medical, HEOR, sales, marketing, market access, all those people. So being able to engage with those people effectively in order to achieve the organizational goals is a big responsibility. Business development, much like with the engagement, is super important because without being able to develop your business, you have no work. Within the agency space, of course, this involves a lot of cold calling and a rehash of your capabilities over and over again to companies who might end up picking you up as a business partner, but internally it functions a little bit different. So from experience, I will say that just this past week, for example, I've been developing a pitch deck for our services in my company because we use that information and that deck and the scientific background and our capabilities presentation in order to pitch our business to other internal stakeholders who may not know that we exist or the extent of our capabilities. So in a sense, the internal business development helps us promote outreach of our services to other departments, and then we end up saving them money through a whole bunch of different factors. But externally, it's similar, but you have to get your foot in the door, essentially. Another responsibility is process development. So as writers, you want to make high-quality assets all the time. In order to do so, you need to develop some standardized processes. So for example, in my organization, we have an intake call. From there, the writer creates the asset, then we send it over to a designer. From the designer, it goes back to the writer to check everything over. Afterwards, it goes to editorial and then over to the client. So having a streamlined process for developing your assets is extremely important because it allows you to deliver high-quality assets consistently, which help build your business and your reputation. So having an in-depth knowledge on how to create those streamlined processes is very important. Of course, team management is a key role as well, a key responsibility, I should say. Medical writers, despite being the ones who tend to generate the asset by themselves, often work in teams, like I said, with a designer, an editorial person, and typically an account and project manager. So being able to navigate your own role and the team dynamics and bring it all together to produce high quality assets is super important. And then, of course, there's a whole professional development component that's not necessarily a written responsibility, but one that is very, how would you put it, necessary for the development of your team and your business as well. So what I mean by that is writers often teach new writers how to produce assets, how to create things, how to be efficient. And so it's more of a mentorship, professional development combination sort of task. So as far as the skills necessary for medical writing go, you can see on screen there's quite a lot of different things. And you can read through this on your own time. But of this list, what's most important to me is the strong scientific acumen, because you end up creating a lot of assets over a variety of different therapeutic areas, right? And so you really need to be able to pick things up quick, understand things like an expert, and then produce it for a target audience who is most likely already an expert on whatever subject you're creating. You also need to have strong communication skills. Like I said earlier, there's a lot of team management and external, internal sort of collaboration between your functional partners and your business partners as well. So being able to hold conversations, having those soft skills, being able to determine what it is that your client really wants, that's all important to creating a great end product. Time management is key, and so is being able to balance your workload. When I was working in agency, I was working on anywhere between 6 to 15 different assets at once. And I wouldn't have been able to do that without strong time management skills. Of course, I worked extreme hours every day. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to get most of those in. But at the same time, being able to manage all those tasks individually and in the context of many different timelines and getting things done on time was super important. Other things, regulatory compliance, of course, is very important, and it really depends on what area of medical writing you're practicing in. So for me, within medical affairs, the GPP, the Good Publication Practices, is super important. Whereas, the International Conference on Harmonization, good manufacturing practices is not something I necessarily interface with any day. So tools of the trade, I'm sure most of you recognize these. So we often use Microsoft Office specifically, not Apple products. So Word, Excel, and PowerPoint are typically our go-to things for creating stuff, whether it be documents, letters to guidelines, slide decks, session mapping using Excel, things of that nature. Communication, we typically use Teams and Outlook. I think that's pretty standard across most companies. But for managing assets, here's where you get some variance. So Viva is our platform where we kind of keep all of our approved and finalized assets. iEnvision is for managing publications at every stage, creation of the manuscript all the way through submission. And then other companies may use something else, but my company specifically uses Workfront, which is a sort of project management, time management program used to keep track of everything. So these programs are super important, one for creating and holding the assets, but also getting the assets out on time and under budget. Of course, this is not a complete list. Like I said, everyone could use something different. And even in my past role, I didn't use most of these outside of the Microsoft Office components. So challenges with medical writing. I alluded to it earlier, but timeline development and project management is super critical. Most of the time, your reputation relies on how adherent you are to your timelines. If you can come under budget, and if you're able to get your project managed well from all stages, from the intake all the way to delivery. Navigating stakeholder feedback and expectations, kind of along those lines, is a second sort of challenge. You need to be able to endure, I would say. It's not all the time that what you create is something that your stakeholder enjoys, right? So, for example, way back, maybe a couple of years ago, I spent 2 or 3 hours creating a personalized graphic of hypertension using a client drug. And I thought it looked really good. I spent a lot of time on it. And it's exactly what the stakeholder had wanted at the time, the client. Well, after presenting it to them, they basically returned it to me saying, yeah, actually, this looks nice, but we don't want it, right? We want this instead. So then you have to look, okay, where are we sitting on the budget? Is it possible to redraw this? How do we proceed with that conversation? If it's not possible, how do we interact with the client and manage those expectations? Do we give him an alternative? Do we try to tell him or her no? How do you do it? How do you navigate it? Having those soft skills is something that really helps you navigate through those scenarios. Because at the end of the day, what you like is not going to be what everyone else likes. And of course, everyone has their personal tastes. So varying scientific complexity is also a major challenge. So as a writer, you have to be very adaptable and ready to pick things up on a dime, because it's a project-based role. So as a project-based role, you're more likely than not to experience multiple different things from multiple different clients based on multiple different needs. So when I was an agency, again, I alluded to it earlier, I worked between 6 and 15 different projects all at once. In certain cases, I was covering Congress strategies for 3 different clients at the same conference for 3 different therapeutic areas, for example. And so for me, the challenge was onboarding myself to those 3 different therapeutic areas, finding out what was important, finding out what aligned with the client's medical strategies, and then being able to adapt to those things and build high quality assets that would, return the business. So it can get very crazy. And of course, project load, which I think at this point I've talked enough about. Okay, so assets themselves. Let's talk about what occurs with medical writing in medical affairs. So I bucketed a couple different assets that you might see as a medical affairs medical writer. Of course, this is not a complete list, but overall, they tend to fall under one of these buckets. So you've got your publications, like your abstracts, your manuscripts, podcasts and videos, your Congress symposia, posters, things like that. Training, you have a lot of training going on with your medical science liaisons who need continuous education to remain subject matter experts in their therapeutic areas of interest. Same with sales. If you have a new product, you need to make sure your salesperson knows everything they can on label about their drug to have those effective conversations in the field. You've got your Congress training, even the KOL development. We build a lot of speaker decks, things that our KOLs will go and give presentations at congresses or to other doctors. That's all part of training. Within medical and brand strategy, you're working on advisory boards, you're working on your reactive assets like your medical information letters and verbal response documents. You've got your brand planning and execution. There's all kinds of stuff that needs to be written, created, and disseminated for explanation of your product, your strategy, and everything else. Even the booth assets. Let's say you're at a conference and you're creating, a video game for your booth, and it's all about teaching you how, this is just an example, but like how a drug interacts with RSV. That's something that I've had to, or something similar rather, that I've had to create in a certain sense through medical writing. With medical education, you've got your disease state decks, your fact sheets, your reactive and proactive decks, so that when a doctor asks a question, you have an answer, or you can show them new information out in the field. Even competitive intelligence, you've got your social monitoring, right? Things you overhear at a conference that you have to write down and create an insight about, or anything you see on Twitter. All that information is collected into one giant document and used to direct that product strategy. And of course, you have your other stuff, like your videos, lexicons. Medical writers typically involve themselves with a lot of graphic design and editing work, editorial, things of that nature. So this is the best part of the deck. I promise you, I'm going to go through some assets that I've personally created. Again, I just want to remind everyone there's no proprietary or confidential material in this deck, and I have sought permissions and been granted them for anything that is displayed or cited. So, competitive analysis. This was a deck I built quite a long time ago related to the Pronounce trial. So there was a drug that came out and Pronounce was looking at a similar drug, and it was like, okay, we think that there's a higher safety incidence rate or a higher safety adverse event incidence rate among these drugs. So they looked at it, and so we're like, okay, what publications favor that one drug, what don't? And you see we've got the whole mechanism of action, right? And so we're looking at all the data, and we're developing the implications for how that study might impact the product information. Advisory boards are super cool. Basically, you get a bunch of KOLs inside a room together, and you present them either new information, you pose questions, and you collect their feedback. So what you see here is what's called a top-line summary. So after the board is done, the writer will take all of the notes that they wrote up during the board and sort of create these action and insight statements. So like top right, you can see, for example, a writer from their notes might write something like, advisors noted challenges in retaining patients compared to acquiring new patients due to whatever. And below you've got your specific insights, like advisors do not unanimously have methods of tracking patient acquisition. Despite the utility of that data, it's seldom examined. Bottom left, you see information on the advisors themselves. Like what's their number of staff, what's their practice size, things that you can use to build your insights and then eventually develop your key takeaways and recommendations, right? And that's really what the money slide is. So as an example, advisors believe that patients will find a practice setting to be more desirable if providers engage in meaningful patient dialogue. That's a key takeaway from the advisory board. And then you can recommend things like host a patient advisory board to gain direct feedback from their perspective, the patient's perspective, on whether new and improved methods of patient acquisition would be desirable. So this all aligns with medical strategy. Advisory boards are a lot of fun. I've done so many of them. You can see here, this was an advisory board I was at related to some radiopharmaceutical products. You could see me there on the left. Oftentimes, they're held in person whenever available because the client tends to have something to show off or display. Also, you want that face-to-face interaction. There's a lot of cool stuff going on, right? Like walking into a nuclear reactor. But you can see they tend to put the advisors into the U, which is this sort of U-shaped seated area here and here. And really what that does is it promotes discussion. And then, of course, you have the writer in the corner somewhere recording all the notes to develop those actions and insights. Posters. good Lord, are there so many posters in medical writing. So this falls under publications, but as you can see, this is sort of a standard set of posters you might find at a conference. So the medical writer would be responsible for all the written and imagery content, its format, all the citations, and making sure that all the points of data are captured relatively well on the poster board. In certain cases, you might also be responsible for developing Congress symposia. So these are some slides of a symposia that was performed at a specific conference that I can't name. But as you can see, the writer would have been responsible for developing the background, methods, results, and conclusions, and then that would go on to be presented by a KOL, for example. Disease state education is one of the most common asset types, so everyone needs to understand why a product is necessary for treatment, right? So in this case, this was a product for asthma. So in order to educate the patient or provider, you tend to walk them through the logical progression of things. So you're building up that background. You're looking at the epidemiology. You're creating an easy and digestible pathogenesis or mechanism of action. And you're kind of talking about where it goes, how it fits into the whole system of the disease, right? And you're sort of categorizing everything and really walking through. And, you could see you're looking at the different phenotypes of inflammatory type 2 asthma states, and you see the mechanism of the action of the product, and you're comparing everything. So those are pretty unique and a lot of fun to build. Very high complexity stuff. And then, of course, you've got your congresses. My personal favorite, I love congresses so much. But you could see here, this was the American Association of Nurse Practitioners Conference. So a client might give a writer everything that would involve the table of contents 1 through 6 here. So they might have a recap, a booth overview and images, any sponsored programs that the client performed, any actions that the team came together to conclude, and of course, medical insights, which are really the key components of these conferences. So as a writer, it would be their responsibility to sort of summarize the key points, or in certain cases, reformat MSL insights and sort of create these effective slides used to overview those key learnings from that conference and sort of classify the level of impact, any action items, things of that nature. And then, of course, you go back in to the executive summary, summarize everything for senior leadership or whoever is part of the end user for what that deck would be, and you're kind of going through it like that. Competitive intelligence is super interesting. You'd think as a medical writer that you're kind of tied to a computer, but it's simply not the case, especially when you're going to conferences. So medical writers actually take somewhat of an active role in conferences side by side with your sales and field medical teams. So here's an example of targets, I would say. So this is ACC 2025. I just pulled this off of their website for this year. And I sort of planned out and created this highlight system, which is what I would normally do for any sort of competitive intelligence. So if my product was a competitor of all these companies, something I would do is I would highlight, as you see here, and then make it a point to scope these sorts of booths out at the conferences and try to pick up on some key learnings. And what that looks like in practice is this. You have your pictures of the booth, you're looking at what data they're presenting, you're looking at how they're doing it, and how they're engaging with their customers and their Congress attendees. So these are not my pictures. I took them off of whatever Ignition DG is, but I sort of created an example of what might go into a sort of competitive intelligence asset. So let's say my product is a dermatology a product, right? And so I would be interested in looking at Lilly, what their dermatology booth involves, the focus, like, okay, they've got seated areas, they've got 3 product displays. There's a separate space for individualized product theaters, but specifically, their displays include phase 3 data. They have the mechanism of action overviews for their product, and they're actively engaging with their customers. So as part of a key insight, I would state, at this conference, Lilly was in charge of, or not in charge of, Lilly is looking at all this stuff. They're displaying this specific data. How does this impact our product? How can we take these learnings and beef up our product display, our Congress engagement for the next year, or in a future conference, or the one next week, things of that nature. So everyone's favorite topics, the education, career progression, and salary, of course. So let's start off with the educational requirements. Now you can see on the left side, I've attempted to classify every level of degree. So we'll just go through it. But for bachelor's and master's degrees, if you want to be a medical writer, it's possible if you're extremely lucky. Oftentimes, what people are looking for is the expertise that comes with that standard minimum requirement of a PhD, PharmD, or medical degree of some kind. And it makes sense because as a writer, you need to have a lot of scientific acumen, and you need a lot of scientific, I guess that's the same thing. Well, you need that acumen, and those PhDs, PharmDs, and doctoral degrees sort of prep you exactly for that role. Of course, there's other factors like having good soft skills and being able to work on project-based scenarios, but that's really the minimum standard requirement. Now, I've seen people with bachelor's and master's degree become medical writers, but it's not necessarily a common sort of thing. As far as career progression goes, this is a sort of standard layout that you might see between agency and industry, which are really the only 2 places that hire medical writers in the context of pharmaceuticals. So what you'll notice immediately is that the paths are somewhat similar in titling, but the years of experience worth of progression is a bit different. So let's talk in terms of fresh graduate. So I'll use PharmD as an example because I'm a PharmD. So if I were to apply right out of school, it's possible that I might be able to make an associate medical writer or medical writer role. Really, the difference is not that much except in salary and company in agency specifically. But moving on from there, depending on the company's titling, you might end up after a couple years as a senior medical writer, a scientific manager, or associate director. In some cases, associate director is the entry-level role for agencies. What's kind of interesting is that compared to the industry, like a company itself, like a pharma company, agencies tend to have abridged sort of progression schemes where you get more senior titles at lesser levels of experience. And that's just an industry trend, it seems. But from there, you end up going to a sort of scientific director role, senior director, and then, of course, your senior leadership. So that would be executive director, VP, president, things of that nature. Industry is a lot more challenging to get into. It's certainly possible to enter into a company as a regular medical writer, but typically you have an established portfolio, prior years worth of experience in a similar sort of function or different sort of company, or you have some sort of circumstance that allows people to reasonably take a chance on bringing you into the fold. Otherwise, your 2 standard paths are 2 to 10 years worth of agency medical writing or through a postdoctoral fellowship, which was my path. So in those standard cases, you end up either as a medical writer through that agency writing, Or in certain cases, if you're lucky, you can enter in at the principal medical writer level, which some companies refer to as associate director or sometimes even senior manager. It sort of depends on the place. But from there, you end up moving to director and then senior director. And of course, if you're lucky and you have the skills and the social capital and the soft power, it is possible to make it to senior leadership. I fervently believe that. But once again, just calling attention to the timeline of events, I tried to match things up top to bottom. You can see for associate director level, years 1 through 6 in terms of years of experience for agency, whereas for the industry, you're typically looking for 5 to 10 years. And you can see there's about a 5-year split in between every level beyond that for the most part. As far as base compensation goes, you'll notice immediately that on the agency side, it's definitely less. Your entry-level roles range typically from $60,000 to $120,000 per year, and then the band sort of tightens and raises a little bit as you start going up and up the ladder. But as far as caps go, the base compensation really starts to open up once you hit those senior leadership levels. Whereas in industry, excluding the postdoctoral fellowship, of which that salary range is pretty standard, once you start hitting the medical and principal medical writing roles, you really start to take off. And so a lot of people wonder, what's the value of agency compared to industry? If you're looking at senior leadership compared to an associate director level role, you tend to, have a better trade-off when you're in industry, especially because, again, these are all base salaries. And as time goes on, and you achieve the higher levels, your compensation increases pretty exponentially. So hiring insights, right? What skills are sought out in a prospective writer? We alluded to this a little bit before, but some of the main components include that prior experience, right? Do you have prior writing experience in or outside of the industry, right? Do you have any publications? Have you written abstracts? Have you created any sort of content, whether it be, personal use, professional use in a different company, whatever? Do you have any experience working in an agency or an actual company? Have you practiced in any sort of clinical setting, which is why those doctoral degrees are valuable, or in a CRO, a contract research organization? These are all key points. Scientific acumen is huge. How has your education level influenced your skills, your knowledges, and experiences, right? Have you worked on any strategy as they relate to pharmaceuticals, medical devices, diagnostics, or even clinical, right? And most importantly, of course, are you able to critically analyze any scientific information and apply the lessons that you learn to the space to develop better assets? And finally, soft skills, which are extremely important. Can you work individually and in team settings? Are you able to present to clients? Are you able to work with clients or your cross-functional partners? Can you do it effectively? If your coworkers had to spend a day traveling with you, would they feel weird about you? Would you feel weird about them? Would there be any sort of issues that would prevent you from translating that over to a team-based scenario? And of course, are you teachable? The medical writing role is all about feedback. You need to be able to take feedback and apply it going forward, even if it's something you don't like. Like we talked about it and touched on it just a little bit, but not always will you have a client that likes what you do or what you create. You need to be adaptable, or in the event that you don't have the skill to match up, you need to be open to being taught those skills by, higher ups or other writers or what have you. All very important points. So let's talk about some current trends in medical writing, because there's quite a bit. So the first one is everyone's favorite. It's artificial intelligence. Now, it's interesting because AI seems to be in the spotlight for taking people's jobs and putting people out of work. But personally, I don't view it that way. For me, AI has always been a sort of augmentation tool and not a substitution for the medical writer themselves. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but one of the major ones is that generative AI, which is what everyone wants to utilize, in my opinion, is often abused, incorrect, it can be misinformed, and I've had it create false information on multiple different occasions. And I'll show you an example after this slide, but as a sort of tool, I personally don't think it will ever replace a writer, but it can definitely help augment their activities. So what I mean by that is, for example, I can spend an hour to an hour and a half, right, 60 to 90 minutes reproducing a table from the text, ensuring that all the values I've transferred over are correct, the table's formatted properly, it's branded with my company's colors, and it has all the footnotes with their respective symbols and whatnot, perfectly compliant, cited, and everything else. Or I can take a screenshot of that table from the text, go to my company's version of ChatGPT, upload that image and say, please create a table for PowerPoint using this image as reference, and it will do it, right? And then I can take that, copy it, paste it into the PowerPoint, and instead of spending 60 to 90 minutes reproducing that table, now all I have to do is fact check it. And of course, there's going to be some values that are incorrect because AI is not perfect, but that's what I mean by augmentation. Now, in the same vein, if you asked ChatGPT or whatever you have to sort of produce a table with data you're giving it, your results might be mixed, and it might make something up. So, for example, early on in my career when ChatGPT first came out, I was using it as a sort of competitive intelligence tool. So I asked it to produce a list of references, 10 references for this certain therapeutic area that I could use to look at and follow up with to produce a competitive intelligence report. Well, it produced me 10 perfect AMA-cited resources, and it was exactly what I was looking for, down to the letter. Except when I went to go look for those resources outside, I had found they were all made up, like completely fabricated from nothing. So, in that sense, generative AI, I don't think at this stage will be something that would replace a writer anytime soon. And of course, you always need that second check, right? So I've heard of terminology where you have hypothetical checkers, which is a sort of weird distinction, but they're people who double check the work of AI. So in practice, in medical writing, maybe that role could exist someday, where the generative AI produces some sort of asset, but at the end of that process, you'd still need a medical writer to go through, check the data, fact check everything, and ensure that it's all correct and bumping. Okay, another trend that we're seeing lately in medical writing is what's called vertical integration. So recently I just spoke about the differences between agencies and pharmaceutical companies and similar sorts of things in other industries. We have now a trend of vertical integration where these companies are starting to build in-house agencies or buy external agencies and bring them in-house. So really high upfront cost, but there's a couple different things that really make this a valuable sort of direction. So one, you've got your internal talent development, right? So you're taking in these people from outside. They've got a high quality of work based on your previous experiences, but now you're training them on all your internal information, all your internal processes, and you're sort of bypassing any compliance issues or differences that might result from working with an outside agency. All right, so you're building your established expert writer user base. Then you also have the downstream effect of that, which is that you're improving that internal collaboration sort of scenario, and you're creating an environment where those external people can have these methods of teamwork with your current cross-functional partners. And so, to give an example, when I was working in agency, a lot of the time I had to do a lot of guesswork as to what my client wanted. And the reason for that is because you're only exposed to so much, and that is all that what your client tells you, right? So I was developing an advisory board one time for a hypertension drug. And the direction I was given was, yeah, we need to establish a scientific narrative for this product. And I mean, that's the most general statement ever, right? So after collecting feedback, okay, we're going to build this product around precision medicine approaches. We're going to look at biomarkers. We're going to do all this stuff, right? Well, that's just one person telling you what needs to be done. Unfortunately, one person does not make up an organization, right? So in that setting, after I had gone through and developed all these, proactive slides for this advisory board, it was only after that the client ended up passing it around to all of his internal partners from marketing, from HEOR. I think there was a salesperson as well. But, when I got that asset back, I had so much feedback that what I built originally sort of looked nothing like what it ended up being. And that's what I mean by the vertical integration. Oops. Give me 1 second. My headphone turned off. I can keep talking though. So that's what I mean by the internal collaboration. When you bring the external people inside, they start to gain the insights related to what the company's strategy is between more than just that individual client, and you start to establish a better team of individuals, and of course, the end result is better assets. Another huge component is that enhanced safety for proprietary and confidential information. So it's not something that occurs often, but it still does happen when you work with an outside partner. You have to transfer assets over to them, and things get lost or leaked in a certain sense. So, for example, I heard once about a client who had taken a proprietary slide deck and sent it through an email link to an agency partner externally. And that partner had downloaded it, put it on a flash drive at a conference, and then they lost the flash drive. And the reason why they were given that in the first place is because they didn't have access to the internal repositories to collect that information, so it was all hand to hand, right? And so that's a really terrible event for compliance, of course. But, in a vertical integration scenario, things like that just wouldn't happen, right? There's no need to carry things on a flash drive. There's no need to take information that's proprietary off of a repository because your vertically integrated partner is going to have access to all that. And of course, you're looking at cheaper costs altogether. So I know of a couple companies that currently have a vertically integrated agency within, for example. And the cost savings is just tremendous. So let's say I was going to build an advisory board slide deck and manage the whole process as an agency outside. So from my experience, those cost anywhere between about $50,000 to about $75,000 to develop everything and go through the whole process of hosting, moderating the ad board, and all the follow-up stuff. A friend of mine who works in an internal agency, instead of charging the company $50,000 to $75,000 is able to do it for about 12 to 15. So that cheaper cost is a really crazy difference when it comes to internal versus external. So those are two major trends. But going back to AI and the abuse of generative AI, I have an example here. So on the left-hand side, you see a case report written by a couple doctors for radiology case reports. Looks pretty standard, but you can see on the right-hand highlighted area, generative AI just kind of destroyed the paper to a meaningful degree. So in summary, the management of bilateral iatrogenic, I'm very sorry, but I don't have access to real-time information or patient-specific data as I am an AI language model. You get stuff like this as a result of that generative AI, right? And I saw Mint wrote in the chat, stuff like that's still happening to this day in regards to the previous subject with it. But, as far as things go, a writer in this position who would be creating this sort of document instead of, the AI language model would pick up on this and be able to address it. Also, the fact that this wasn't caught likely means that this paper didn't go through editorial whatsoever, and the information could be completely wrong, right? And so more and more you're starting to see these instances where, these publications are being removed, right? And you can see, this always makes me laugh, but it says the article has been removed at the request of the editors-in-chief and the authors because informed patient consent was not obtained, right? And it has absolutely nothing to do with the authors using a generative AI source in the writing process, even though reasonably that's probably exactly the reason, if you had to make a guess, right? So just as a wrap-up, I have some final advice here. So if you want to break into the role, I recommend targeting agency roles before industry roles. And the reason for that is because they're much more accessible. The industry roles, despite having a higher pay ceiling and better quality of life in terms of work-life balance, they're much tougher to get, way more competitive, and you just need to get your foot in the door. Of course, you can transfer out of agency at around the 2-year mark. Maybe it'll take longer, but it's a great spot for breaking in. Emphasizing your transferable skills and experiences. How is your clinical knowledge? How is your writing knowledge? How is your portfolio and whatnot transition or transfer into this role, And show off your social skills. You want to be liked by your coworkers. You want to have fun with your coworkers. You want to make sure that they don't look at you as a weirdo because, no one wants to work with a weirdo at the end of the day. Certification's interesting. There's 2 certifications I think that might be important in regards to medical writing, and that would be the Certified Medical Publication Professional Cert, which is basically the good publication practices sort of certification. And then, of course, Project Management Professional is somewhat self-explanatory. The key point here is that neither are necessary for success in this career path. I don't have them. I'm not planning to get them, but I do know that they've helped other people break into the role and have success in the role. And of course, building a portfolio is super important. So any publications, slide decks, posters, abstracts, what have you, anything you've created in a writing sense, if you can show off that you have the writing skills, that makes it that much easier for someone to take a chance on you. And of course, your opportunities expand as well. So that wraps up our presentation today. We are going to begin our Q&A section now. I would like for anyone that has a question to either type it in the chat, or I believe if you raise your hand, I might be able to bring you in as a speaker, but we'll see. All right, I see some people typing. Okay, so Mint asks, what's the biggest gap you currently see in incoming medical writers? Is it statistical literacy, domain knowledge, communication nuance, or something else? The biggest gap, aside from actual experience, I think, is being able to prove your scientific acumen. So, statistical literacy is, of course, very important, as well as domain knowledge, although both can be taught. When you're entering into a writing role, a big component of the interview is typically what's called a writing test. So, you'll either get a prompt, a set of slides, or something similar, and it's your responsibility as the incoming writer, the interviewee, to sort of create a high quality asset based off of what you're given. In my company, for example, we give you a publication from one of our clinical trials, and we ask you to write a sort of journal club slide presentation, so a short background slide, a method slide, results, and discussion. And if you're able to show off the main points, for example, like you're able to pick out the important details and then present it on like a live presentation, that's a good sign. So you'd be surprised. There's a lot of people who lack the nuance, both in the scientific literacy and the ability to put it into words. They might be really good at explaining things, but when it comes to the written media and the presentation, they fall short. So I would say that that would be the biggest gap currently. Harry 098883 asks or says, you talked about the differences between agency and industry in terms of years of experience and salary, but how different is the day-to-day? I've heard that industry is essentially better pay, better work-life balance, and generally better than agency all around, except for barrier to entry. So this is an interesting question. I would say from my personal experience, having worked in agency and now industry, it's pretty significantly different. P less than 0.05 for sure. So I think from the day-to-day sort of scenario, when I was working in agency, I was working anywhere between 60 to 80 hours a day pretty consistently. And on certain occasions, I would be working well beyond that. So in 2022, I think it was, I was working ID week, all the Congress strategy for 3 different clients simultaneously. And I think for the 3-week period, the week before, the week during, and the week after the conference, I logged something like 115 hours on average per week. And so as an agency partner, you're sort of expected to bend over backwards in order to please your client, because when your client has a good experience, they're more likely to come back and ask for more work, right? It's sort of the lifeline of that agency life, whereas industry tends to move a lot slower. There's more red tape, or yellow tape, I should say, and a lot more people that things need to pass through, like your assets, right? So in that regard, it's been a lot more chill here on the industry side. Instead of working 60 to 80 hours, I tend to work a maximum of 40, maybe a little bit above that if we're having like a really intense period. And of course, you saw the salary breakdown at my level compared to what it showed in agency. There's about like a $70,000 to $80,000 difference potentially. So all in all, I personally enjoy working in the industry sponsorship company side better than the agency. Although some people really like that sort of hectic, action-packed lifestyle, but it's not for me. Mint asks, what trends are you seeing in pharma and medtech in integrating medical writing earlier in the product cycle? Are your responsibilities expanding more into preclinical or commercial strategy? And is there a growing need for medical writers to understand health economics, market access, or outcomes research as your expectations expand? Great question. So, in regard to the product cycle, I can only really speak for my own experiences, which rely mostly within medical affairs and HEOR. Now, towards the beginning of the presentation, we did talk about a variety of different practice areas for medical writing. I'll bring those up here. So medical writers tend to specialize within one of these 5 areas. But there can be some crossover. So I have a little bit of commercial and market access work under my belt, but I tend to rely mostly on that medical affairs and HEOR. And as far as the product life cycle goes, I've been pretty involved in everything from preclinical all the way through phase 4 and beyond. So I don't necessarily think there's an expansion of the responsibilities. And a lot of that has to do with the dynamic behind how medical writing works, which is that it's project-based work, right? So you might spend years working on a scientific platform, and then all of a sudden you have a client come to you and they're like, hey, we need you to look at this rat data and create a publication out of it. Well, now you've gone from phase 3, phase 4, all the way back to preclinical, or in certain scenarios, you might be working on publications your entire time, and then another client might come up and be like, hey, we're trying to build up an HEOR study. We need this deck to look at the landscape and how patients interact with the medicine and, all this market access information. So really, it sort of bounces all around. As far as your second question goes, whether or not there's a growing need for medical writers in understanding the other functional areas, I think there's always a need. It's just that medical writers tend to specialize in one sort of area, and so you really have these distinctions between things. Mint asks again, what do you feel like is the most underappreciated challenge medical writers like you face when translating complex data into content for different stakeholders, such as regulatory, HCPs, or patients? Let me think on that one. Most underappreciated challenge writers face. I think probably being able to... I would say as a sort of underappreciation dynamic, I think a lot of people look at medical writers as a sort of, I guess like generative AI. They just create stuff, right? They don't really think there's any sort of strategy behind it or whatnot, or, they're told what to do and they do it. For me, a lot of my job involves creating assets that align with the existing strategies or pushing the boundaries on those strategies based on what I find in literature, for example, and tying that back to things. So from the perspective of creating assets, there's a lot of strategic thinking involved in how to present the message, how to build the narrative for that message, and how to tailor that message to the end user. So as far as underappreciation goes, I don't necessarily think that it's a sort of how would you put it? I don't think it's like devious in nature. I think it's just in general a lack of understanding of the role itself and the dynamics it poses in creating these assets. But, to counteract that, I often spend a lot of time talking with my clients on calls, providing them justification for why I did things, where I think we should go, how things relate to the current strategies. And I've noticed that my clients specifically have developed a lot of respect for that sort of critical and strategic thinking that I think has really brought us closer together and, of course, created excellent assets. Harry asks, once you get experience with HEOR or market access or any area like that, do you tend to get siloed into that space for the rest of your career? Great question. Unlike most specializations in other degrees and other fields, I think medical writing is unique in the sense that a lot of the jobs just look at writing experience in general. When I'm on LinkedIn, a lot of recruiters tend to hit me up for regulatory and clinical development positions, and they see, of course, my experience as a medical affairs HEOR-based writer, and so I would say there's not really a sort of silo trend in that. So, I mean, realistically, if you want to swap to commercial from medical affairs or vice versa, it's definitely possible, I would say. FDA writes, was your title or level of responsibility affected by the transition, and how did you advocate for yourself during that process? Yeah, so great question. I moved from agency as a postdoctoral fellow into a principal medical writing role from agency to industry. So I think what really was different about it is I skipped a couple titles going in. And so my level of responsibility definitely increased simply by the nature of the level. But also, I think it was easier to advocate for myself because my program really put me through the fire in a certain sense. And what I mean by that is, again, alluding to the 60 to 80 hour weeks, I was jam-packed all the time. I learned so many things. I had plenty of opportunities to develop my skills. And I think that really sort of pushed me ahead of all the other candidates that were going for that role at that time. So I mentioned it earlier. My company initiates a medical writing exam for prospective medical writers when they interview. Well, I was able to show off a portfolio of assets that I hand developed outside of my job at the time, and so in a sense, my skills sort of spoke for themselves, and I was able to have that self-advocacy that sort of transitioned me into that role. But for others I've heard from, I think the transition in is actually a lot easier going from agency to industry, specifically because the workload and the expectations and the slowdown based around all that yellow tape. Let's see. Timo asks, I've worked with many medical writers in the past. Do you think aspiring writers should be cautious of what functional area they go into in order to avoid being pigeonholed? And then he follows up with, for example, clinical medical writers who author and format clinical documents for regulatory submission, such as protocols and study reports, and then trying to get into commercial and medical affairs later. So yeah, we touched on it a little bit, but it is easier to go into a different specialization of medical writing for sure. It's not quite as challenging as what you might find in a different sort of industry or functional area. It's certainly possible. Again, it's all about your transferable skills in being able to state with confidence, like, yeah, I've worked on clinical study protocols, but I can definitely create disease state decks or MSL training documents. Here's how my current skills in this role would translate to that role. Here's the level of scientific complexity that, allows me to perform that responsibility. Things like that. Okay, Mint writes, what's one strategic change you'd implement industry-wide if you could redesign the medical writing function from scratch today? Okay, so one strategic change is sort of something that's already occurring, so it would be that vertical integration. If it were up to me, I would completely get rid of outside external agencies altogether and instead opt to bring all those people in-house and develop that talent internally. One, because from my personal experiences, being able to work cross-functionally with all our partners has definitely improved the quality of my assets, but it's also bettered my understanding of what my role is, how I interact with everyone else in their roles, and the full scope of actions that I can take to really produce everything. So, while agency is nice in the sense that you get a lot of exposure, it's also a sort of hindrance in that aspect. So that's what I would change. Mint asks, what are the biggest misconceptions students have about medical writing, and what surprises them most once they start working in it? I think it goes back to the complexity and the pizzazz of the position. So I think a common view overall of medical writing is that they just create things, and it's sort of, drone work to some degree. But like we discussed earlier, there's a lot of strategy involved in the writing. There's a lot of details necessary to ensure you're getting your message across, that you're building something effective. And of course, there's a whole creativity aspect to it. So I think for students, based on the interns I've taught and mentored, their favorite part is being able to create something from scratch in their vision that clients or whoever else it happens to be actually enjoy and utilize. One of my favorite things as an intern that I still enjoy today is Congress assets. When I build a presentation for a speaker and they go on to present it in front of a live audience, and you're sitting there and you're seeing exactly what you created on screen behind the presenter. To me, that's something so cool. And the interns whom I've mentored in the past also have experienced similar feelings. I think that's one of the biggest surprises. All right, I don't see any more questions in the chat. I'm going to give it another 20 seconds. Maybe 10 seconds. I don't see too much activity or anyone typing. So why don't we conclude it here, actually? I just want to thank everyone who attended today. This session ended up going quite longer than I thought it would. But thank you all so much for coming to the first Biocentrica Presents. And of course, we're having another event next week. Timo will be presenting on clinical science. And so we'll see you then. Thank you so much.